34 seconds. That is how long Pete Hegseth sat completely still after Adam Smith placed the first document on the table. Not the budget document Hegseth had prepared for. Not the procurement figures his staff had briefed him on the night before. A different document entirely. One that had been sitting inside a classified congressional file for 5 weeks while the House Armed Services Committee was denied the public hearing it had been requesting since the first week of the war. Smith had been waiting 5 weeks for this moment, and Hegseth had been doing everything in his power to avoid it. Here is exactly what happened. The hearing had been scheduled as a routine Pentagon budget review. That framing was not accidental. A budget hearing is the kind of proceeding that generates coverage of line items and procurement figures, not questions about military failures, press blackouts, and the worst special forces disaster in half a century. Hegseth's team had prepared accordingly. Talking points about defense spending priorities, statistics about operational effectiveness, a carefully constructed narrative about American military strength in a challenging environment. What they had not prepared for was a ranking member who had spent 5 weeks watching his committee get stonewalled, classified briefings get postponed, and public hearings get pushed to dates that kept moving further away. Hegseth arrived with his standard setup: 3 aides, prepared remarks. The particular composure of a man who has spent years in front of cameras and understands how to project confidence when the questions get uncomfortable. He checked his notes once. He looked at the committee roster. That was the last comfortable moment he would have in that room. Because Adam Smith had been sitting at the far end of that table with a single folder in front of him. Closed. Untouched. The top Democrat on the House Armed Services Committee, a man who had been publicly demanding this hearing for 35 days, a man who had met with Hegseth at the Pentagon the previous week and left that meeting, according to his own public statement, without answers to the most basic questions about a war that was now in its 5th week. At 10:23 a.m., the chairman recognized him for questioning. Smith opened the folder. "Secretary Hegseth," he said, and his voice carried the specific quality of someone who has been waiting a long time to ask something and has spent that time making sure the question is unanswerable. "I want to start with something that happened on March 14th, 3 weeks into this conflict, inside Isfahan." Hegseth's expression stayed composed. His hands remained still on the table. "On March 14th, United States Special Operations Forces conducted a covert raid on a facility in Isfahan. I want to give you the opportunity to describe that operation to this committee in your own words. What happened in Isfahan on March 14th? 2 seconds of silence. "Congressman, covert special operations activities are classified and cannot be characterized in an open setting. I would be happy to address this in a classified." "We have been requesting a classified briefing for 5 weeks, Smith said. His voice didn't rise. It simply became more precise. "The committee has been denied adequate access to information about this conflict since the first week of the war. Today is the first public opportunity this committee has had to question you. I am asking about Isfahan." The room had gone quiet. The specific quiet of a hearing room where everyone present understands that something real is happening. Hegseth's right hand moved fractionally toward the edge of the table. His lead aide, seated behind him, leaned forward almost imperceptibly. "Congressman, I understand the committee's desire for information. We have been working through appropriate classified channels to." "A federal court," Smith said, "issued a ruling stating that your press blackout at the Pentagon was unlawful. Your exact words when you shut down press access were that you were doing so for operational security. A federal judge disagreed. Can you explain to this committee why the Secretary of Defense took an action that a federal court later ruled was illegal?" Hegseth opened his mouth. His attorney, seated 2 chairs to his left, an unusual presence at a budget hearing, leaned forward. "Congressman, we believe the court's ruling was incorrect and we are pursuing appropriate legal remedies." "The court ruled it was unlawful," Smith said. "That is the current legal status. Your press blackout was ruled unlawful. I want to ask you why you did it. Not what you think about the ruling. Why you shut down press access to the Pentagon during an active military conflict for the first time in American history." 34 seconds of silence. Every camera in the room repositioned. 2 Republican members who had been preparing their own questions set their papers down simultaneously. A journalist in the press gallery stopped typing for the first time in 40 minutes. Because 34 seconds of silence from a Secretary of Defense in response to a question about why he took an action a federal court called unlawful is not a procedural pause. It is not a classification concern. It is the sound of someone who does not have an answer they are willing to give in public. Hegseth finally spoke. His voice had lost something. The television host's fluency was still there, but underneath it something had tightened. Congressman, the decisions made during active combat operations are made under circumstances of enormous complexity and time pressure. The goal at every moment was to protect operational security and the lives of American servicemen and women. American servicemen and women, Smith said quietly. Let's talk about that. He reached into the folder and produced a second document. Independent military analysts reviewing publicly available information about what happened in Isfahan have described it as the worst Special Forces disaster in approximately 50 years. Multiple C-130 aircraft lost. Forces that walked into what analysts described as a trap set by Iranian intelligence. Secretary Hegseth, can you tell this committee how many American service members were killed or injured in Isfahan on March 14th? 4 seconds. Congressman, casualty figures from classified operations cannot be disclosed in an open. The War Powers Resolution, Smith said, requires the President to report to Congress within 48 hours when American forces are introduced into hostilities. It requires full information about the circumstances necessitating the introduction of forces. Your department has been in violation of that reporting requirement since the beginning of this conflict. Are you aware of that? Hegseth's jaw tightened, the same small movement that cameras at congressional hearings are specifically positioned to catch. Congressman, the administration believes it has complied with all applicable legal requirements. Senator Tim Kaine disagrees, Smith said. He produced a third document. Senator Roger Wicker, the Republican chairman of the Senate Armed Services Committee, has stated publicly that he hopes to hold a hearing on the Iran war sometime in the month of May. That would be after the 60-day deadline under the War Powers Resolution. Secretary Hegseth, the law requires Congress to authorize the continuation of military operations at 60 days. What is your department's position on whether this conflict will require congressional authorization? 3 seconds. Congressman, the legal basis for the current military operations is sound, and the administration will address any statutory questions through appropriate. The 60-day clock, Smith said, expires before Congress has even held a single public hearing on this war. He set the document down. You shut down press access. You postponed classified briefings. You delayed public hearings. You denied this committee the information it is legally entitled to receive. And now the statutory deadline for congressional authorization is approaching, and your answer is that the administration will address it through appropriate channels. He looked directly at Hegseth. Secretary Hegseth, I want to ask you a direct question. Not about classification, not about legal strategy. A direct question about accountability. He paused. You have no prior command-level military experience. You were previously flagged by the D.C. National Guard. You oversaw the worst Special Forces operation in half a century. You shut down press access in a way a federal court called unlawful. You postponed congressional briefings for weeks. One beat. Do you believe you were the right person for this job? The room held completely still. Hegseth's hands pressed flat against the table. His aide behind him stopped writing. His attorney looked at the table. Congressman, I serve at the pleasure of the President of the United States, and I am proud to. That is not what I asked. Smith's voice was flat, final. I asked if you believe you were the right person for this job. The American people have service members in a conflict that is now in its 5th week with no congressional authorization, no adequate oversight, and no public accounting of what happened in Isfahan. I am asking you directly. Do you believe your background prepared you for the decisions you have made? 17 seconds of silence. Hegseth's attorney rose. Congressman, this line of questioning goes beyond the scope of a budget hearing and my client. Your client, Smith said, is the Secretary of Defense of the United States. He is testifying before the committee with jurisdiction over the defense budget and military operations. Every question I have asked is within the scope of this committee's oversight authority. He closed the folder. Secretary Hegseth, this committee has been waiting 35 days for this hearing. 35 days during which American forces have been in active combat. 35 days during which this committee has been denied the information it is legally entitled to receive. 35 days during which a federal court ruled that your department acted unlawfully. He looked directly at Hegseth. The American people deserve to know what happened in Isfahan. They deserve to know how many service members were lost. They deserve to know why the press was shut out. They deserve to know why classified briefings were postponed. And they deserve to know whether the person running the Department of Defense during one of the most consequential military actions in a generation was prepared for that responsibility. He folded his hands. I am formally requesting that this committee receive a full classified briefing on the Isfahan operation within 7 days, a complete casualty report, a full legal explanation of the press blackout decision, and a written response from the Secretary of Defense addressing each of the questions he declined to answer in this hearing. He looked at the chairman, because the 60-day clock is running. The War Powers Resolution is the law, and this committee is not going to let another deadline pass without answers. By the time the gavel fell, 3 things had already happened. Smith's office had formally submitted the 7-day briefing request in writing. 2 Republican members had privately told their staff they would support a bipartisan oversight motion. And somewhere inside the Pentagon, the questions that had gone unanswered in that hearing room were suddenly the most urgent items on the building's legal agenda. 34 seconds of silence, 5 weeks of stonewalling, 1 unlawful press blackout, and a Secretary of Defense who couldn't answer whether he was the right person for the job. The 60-day clock is still running. The questions are still unanswered. And Adam Smith made sure the entire country knows both of those things. But here is what the numbers alone cannot capture. What it means that this hearing happened at all. For 35 days, the House Armed Services Committee, the congressional body specifically created to oversee the United States military, was denied a single public opportunity to question the Secretary of Defense about an act of war. Briefings were postponed. Hearings were delayed. The ranking member of the committee met with Hegseth at the Pentagon and left without answers to basic questions about a conflict that had already cost American lives. The budget hearing format was not a coincidence. It was a calculation. A budget hearing limits the scope of questioning. It gives the witness prepared ground to stand on. It creates the appearance of congressional oversight without the substance of it. Adam Smith understood that calculation, and he came anyway, with a folder, with 5 weeks of unanswered questions, with the specific patience of someone who has been denied access to information they are legally entitled to and has decided that the first public opportunity to ask for it is not going to be wasted on line items. 35 days. 1 unlawful press blackout. 1 catastrophic Special Forces operation that independent analysts described as the worst in 50 years. A 60-day war powers clock that was going to expire before Congress had held a single substantive hearing. And a Secretary of Defense who sat in silence for 34 seconds when asked why he did what a federal court later called illegal. The ceasefire is holding for now. The Islamabad talks are fragile. The 60-day deadline is approaching. And the questions that went unanswered in that hearing room on April 29th are not going away. They are the most important questions in Washington. And Adam Smith made sure the entire country heard them asked.